There are a number of arguments called ontological arguments, and we're only going to talk about a few of them. The most famous of these arguments comes from St. Anselm of Canterbury. What we're going to do in this lecture is just talk about the beginning of his argument, or to put it another way, the first of his two arguments. For one way to read Anselm was as having given us two arguments. We won't worry much about what the word ontology means. Some people would say it's the study of being or existence. We don't need to get hung up on that. What's going on here is that Anselm is taking the concept of a certain kind of being. We might say a perfect being, in any case a being than which none greater can be conceived, to use his language. And Anselm analyzes that to come to the conclusion that you must admit that something in reality answers to that concept. Now, Anselm didn't think this is how he knew that God existed. Anselm thought that he knew this by faith. That may sound like a contradiction to some modern ears. In Catholic tradition, it's not. Faith isn't just blind belief in Catholic tradition, but we needn't go into the ins and outs of that. Whatever you think of this concept of knowledge by faith, what's really going on here is different. Anselm thinks he has a proof that atheism is incoherent, and this proof breaks into two parts, or two sub-proofs if you like. In the Proslogion he offers both of these. We're going to look at one of them here. So here's the basic argument. God we understand to be a being than which none greater can be conceived. Well, that's a funny phrase, but the point is here it's not just a limit on human conception. The notion of God as a being so great that it makes no sense to imagine conceiving of a greater being. That's a notion of God that Anselm would say the atheist, as we might say the fool if we followed his language, that the atheist understands. The atheist may not agree that there is such a being, but Anselm thinks the atheist has the concept of a being so great that none greater can be conceived. As Anselm puts it, this means God exists in the fool's understanding. Now, we'll put this in Anselm's way at first, and then we'll see that there's another way of putting things here that's less peculiar and perhaps has more chance of succeeding. But following Anselm's presentation, suppose for reductio that God exists only in the understanding and therefore isn't a real being. Well then, says Anselm, we can conceive of a greater being, one that has actual existence, one that exists in reality. But if that's right, then we would be able to conceive of a greater being than this merely conceptual being that exists only in the understanding, and now we have an absurdity. We'd be saying that we can conceive of a greater being than the being than which none greater can be conceived. That sounds contradictory. Anselm thinks it is. Therefore, if we suppose that God exists only in the understanding, Anselm thinks we reach an absurdity. Here's another way to think about it that may be less troublesome, because this notion of comparing an imaginary or merely conceptual being with an actual being may seem peculiar. So here's another way to think of it. What Anselm is in effect saying is that God is conceived of as a perfect being, a being that has all perfections. Now, perfections include various things. Omnipotence is a perfection. Omniscience, all-knowingness. Omnibenevolence, perfect goodness. Those are perfections. It seems that Anselm thinks of existence itself as a perfection, that existence is a state or quality or whatever that could characterize a being, and that, other things equal, an existing being is greater by virtue of having a perfection, this perfection of existence. So if we say that God doesn't exist, we've taken away, so to speak, a perfection from this list. We can conceive of a greater being, one that's not only omnipotent, omniscient, and omnibenevolent, and whatever else we need here, but also has the perfection of existence. If we say that God doesn't exist and we understand God to be perfect, it would be like saying triangles have three sides by definition, but some triangle has only two sides. That's perhaps the most straightforward and least troublesome way to conceive of what Anselm was up to here. Now, in any case, as Anselm presents his argument, it's a reductio. He's asked us to assume, for argument's sake, that there's no God, and then he shows that this leads to an absurdity. On our way of putting it, it comes rather quickly. Assume that there's no God, and then notice that, as Anselm was right, existence is a perfection. So we'd be saying that the perfect being lacks a perfection, which, once again, would seem to be absurd. There have been many objections to Anselm's argument, and we'll be considering more than just this one, but to get us started, I wanted to state the earliest objection by the monk Gneo. Some people think that this objection is knocked down by itself. I think, in fact, that's too quick. So we'll get the objection out on the table. We'll talk about why it's probably too quick to think that it's decisive, and then we'll save more detailed discussion for later. So Gneo didn't disagree with the conclusion. Gneo agreed that God existed, but he thought there was a problem with the reasoning. And the way that he went about showing this was he said, let's tweak the premise a little bit to get a first premise that seems equally acceptable, and then reason in exactly the way that Anselm does, but end up with a conclusion that we know to be false. If we can do that, we've shown that there's something wrong with the reasoning, because our premises, Gneo would say, are just as good as Anselm's. The problem must be in the pattern of reasoning. So that's what Gneo set out to do. Here's one way to restate what Gneo did. Consider the concept of an island in which none greater can be conceived. We'll just use the word grand insula for that. And then rewrite Anselm's argument. Every place Anselm says God, say grand insula. Every place where Anselm says being than which none greater can be conceived, say island than which none greater can be conceived. You've got an argument with exactly the same form. The premise seems innocuous enough that what we mean by grand insula is an island in which none greater can be conceived. Everything seems to roll along, but we end up with the absurd conclusion that some actually existing island is so great that you couldn't conceive of a greater one. That seems crazy. There must be something wrong with the argument. Here's a way of spelling out the replacement, taking Anselm's argument and making the replacements that I described. You can take a look at this. You can see what I mean. The point is that we end up, once again, Gneo would say, with something absurd if we think Anselm's argument is okay. And therefore we'd have to say that there really is a greatest conceivable island, but that's mad. That's nuts. Gneo didn't tell us exactly what he thought the detailed mistake in reasoning was. His point is that there must be such a mistake. That is to say, Gneo's argument is a kind of reductio too. It's what we might call a meta-reductio. He's assuming for the sake of argument that Anselm's reasoning is correct, that his reasoning is valid reasoning. And then he uses that assumption, that Anselm's argument follows valid principles of reasoning, to derive a ridiculous conclusion. And therefore, Gneo rejects the assumption that Anselm's reasoning was acceptable. Not his conclusion, but his argument. Now, what can we say about this? Well, it seems very tempting at first. You sort of think Gneo is reasoning in exactly the same way as Anselm. He's just substituted a slightly different first premise. But therein potentially lies the problem. The problem is this. Anselm has implicitly assumed that the greatest conceivable being is indeed a coherent idea. After all, when he says that the fool or the atheist has this concept, what he's implicitly saying is there's a coherent concept here, and the atheist understands the concept. Anselm thinks, in other words, that the idea of a perfect being is conceivable. We can say a lot of things about what a perfect being would be like. It would be omnipotent. It would be omniscient. It would be omnibenevolent. You might also notice, and this is a point that Anselm brings out himself, that it would be a being that didn't exist as an ordinary space-time object. Any ordinary space and time object you conceive of or can point out is not going to be the greatest thing you could conceive of. I can conceive of an ordinary space-time island. It's not going to be the greatest being I can conceive of. I can take any actually existing ordinary object, no matter how glorious it might be in many ways. I can still conceive of a greater being, a greater thing. But now here's the problem. The idea of a perfect being may actually make sense. It may be conceivable, whether such a thing exists or not. The idea of a perfect island? That's not so clear. It's not clear that there's a coherent concept here. It's not clear that we know what it would mean to say that something is the greatest conceivable island. It doesn't seem to pick out any coherent idea. And it's arguably, at least, not just because of something about islands in particular, but any sort of limited being that we picked on would at least plausibly present us with the same problem. It's not clear what would count as one that was the greatest conceivable one of that kind. The point is this. Anselm's argument is about being as such. It's not about a particular kind of being or classification of being. It's about a being considered qua being, as some would put it. And there, Anselm thinks, the idea of a perfect being gets a grip. But in the case of something like an island, what various people have argued in response to Gneo is that you no longer have a coherent concept here. In other words, the premise that it's that the call him the a-insulus, the person who doesn't believe in the perfect island, the premise that such a person actually has the concept of a perfect island is very dubious, and so the analogy doesn't go through. If that's right, then Gneo's criticism fails. He's falsely assumed that he's dealing with a coherent concept when he talks about this perfect island. And so, contrary to what he needs to make his refutation work, he hasn't given a proof or even a shutter quote proof of a perfect island. Now we'll have more to say about Anselm's argument, but this at least gets us started, and it points out that just maybe this criticism that is often the first one people hear about isn't quite as knocked down as it might have seemed.